Good morning. I'm going to talk about innovation in territorial services. And in some ways, I guess I represent the kind of Cinderella area, in that if we look at the history of research investment, and we've had hints of that in what we've heard already today, most of the research and development effort goes into the productive parts of forestry. About 7 or 8 years ago, I was involved in a major bit of research for the Forestry Commission looking at the regional development value of forestry in England. We came to the conclusion, looking at the regional development impact of forestry in 2 forest areas in England, that over 90% of the regional economic value, actual pounds that were flowing around regional economies, derived from tourism and services related to forestry, and from people moving in there, living close to trees in tree-rich areas which they valued as living space, rather than anything that came out of the forest as productive value. In fact, it was more like 95% of the value. Yet we continue to throw money into the production side when we know that basically the European economy has prospered and grown on the basis of services. I think explaining that paradox should be one of the functions of this action. What I want to do is just give you some insights into the nature of innovation in territorial goods and services and try and grasp what I think is actually a grey, complex and rather diffuse area to look at, but one which is nonetheless profoundly significant in terms of the outcomes on human well-being, which we all too often ignore if we get obsessed with the product and the product supply chain and not human well-being as a consequence. So, just a few realities, which I've hinted at already. Firstly, we know that the primary industries have been in decline for many years. The figure that I quoted from the OECD report on Scotland is representative of what's happening throughout Europe. Over the last decade or so, a 10, 15, 20% drop in the farm workforce. The forest workforce, I believe, has moved in a largely similar direction. But at the same time, a significant growth in the rural economy in service-related employment. That's an incontrovertible fact. But there is one very, very important, if you like, shadow at the heart of that services carnival. And that is that a number of commentators, highly respected commentators, have argued that a perfect storm, as they call it, of climate change, food and water shortages, could change the declining situation in the farm sector, in the fibre sector, in the natural resources sector dramatically. We still have very large global population growth. We are inevitably going to face the consequences of climate change. And if we do get tightening of supplies of primary products, then it could easily lead to what we might call a neo-productivist view of the rural economy. We must take that into account as a very real possibility. But as I speak at present, there are many arable fields lying idle in Scotland because cereals prices are about 60 to 70 pounds, 75 euros a tonne. People aren't bothering to cultivate their land because prices are so low. So we are waiting and hoping that things will get better in the primary sector. We need to bear in mind that perfect storm might come, and it might come sooner than we expect. We saw a little glimpse of it in 2007 in what happened to primary commodity prices then. Okay, let's move on. So the third point I want to make is that we talk about having European rural policies. Actually, we don't really have European rural policies. We have European farm policies, which now have spawned a second pillar, which calls itself rural, but actually is primarily supporting farming and a little bit of forestry, and a tiny bit, 5% or so, through LEADER. But actually, if we're looking at that sector that it's supporting, it's probably less than 5% of the aggregate European rural economy. So it's not targeting to areas of growth again. Forestry is there, on the radar, a little, in Axis 2 and to a certain extent in Axis 3 as well, of Pillar 2. But it is not a very prominent bit, and certainly in our Scottish context, it's a bit that is way, way behind performance in terms of meeting planting targets. Increasingly, though, I detect amongst policymakers in the UK, and I think more globally, an interest in the full suite of ecosystem services that primary land use provides. And if we take such a view, then I reckon that within the next 10 to 15 years, we will see a rising eminence of forestry because of the multiple positive ecosystem services that it delivers in terms of carbon sequestration, in terms of water and flood management, in terms of a whole variety of recreational and cultural services that come from forestry. If we can value these services properly, then they become an incredibly important foundation for prosperity in the forest industry and indeed prosperity in rural areas. But back to my topic of forest-based territorial services. What I want to do is add that word good into there, because actually there are some products that come out from what we call these territorial goods and services. And if we try and define what I mean by these, they're wood products or services where place or territoriality are a significant attribute. Any product or any service is actually, some economists would argue, a bundle of attributes. The stronger that territoriality is a place attribute in that product or service, then the more it comprises a territorial service, in our view. In other words, we're talking about a special type of non-timber forest product, and the obvious parallel that we've got here is what's happened in the European food sector, where we recognise PDO, PGIs, these various ways in which place-specific attributes are embodied in food. The question we have to ask is, do we have a significant forest parallel to that? Now, if we look at these territorial goods and services, and that's the shorthand that I'm using, they are broadly equivalent to a large degree with non-timber forest products, as defined by the FAO. But if we look at that FAO definition, what we actually find is that these are all products of biological origin. So, yes, I can treat chestnuts or mushrooms or wild food or berries as territorial goods and services. But actually, the really important ones that I'm talking about are actually services that people are using that aren't biological. It's the presence of being on a mountain bike in the forest or on a walk in the forest. Those are the things that have enormous value, and they're not encapsulated by that FAO definition. So we're more interested, in fact, in the non-biological services, but we also want to include the FAO ones, especially where they've got place specificity or territoriality as elements. So territorial goods and services from our perspective can be seen as any non-timber benefit arising from woodland, including all those forms of microclimatic, climate change mitigation, hydrological, edaphic, hunting, cultural, recreational and educational benefits. There's a lot there. It's a very complex muddle. It's a bit like a supermarket trolley when you've rushed around the supermarket, thrown all the bits in, and then are trying to work out what the value and where it should go of what you've just taken out. So, a little bit more on territoriality as a product attribute. Just one or two, a very old map of the Cairngorm National Park here. The Cairngorm National Park is Scotland's largest national park. On that map, produced in the 1920s, you've got a Caledonian pine. That pine tree is absolutely embedded in the identity of that area as a national park. It's the largest concentration of native pine wood in Britain, and it's there as part of the character. I live in a village a couple of miles away from where the Aberdeen was put into Aberdeen Angus. That bull is at the entrance to the village that I live in. It gives it place specificity. Aberdeen Angus as a breed is in Australia, Argentina,